The Faded Voice presents I Was There, True Slave Narratives. Part 1, Roots of Bondage, The Making of American Slavery. They say the sea remembers the cries of those it swallows. Long before the first whip cracked on American soil, an ocean carried human souls chained together in darkness. They came from kingdoms with names that echo through time: Dahomey, Ashanti, Yoruba. Men and women stolen in the dead of night, children torn from the warmth of home, marched to the coast by slavers, forced onto ships built for suffering. It was called the Middle Passage, a name that sounds ordinary until you see it through their eyes. Shackled side by side, row upon row, in airless holes reeking of sweat, blood, and fear. Some died before they even saw the New World. Bodies slipped overboard into hungry waters. Some chose the ocean over bondage, leaping into the depths rather than live without freedom. Their whispers drift in the waves even now, if you care to listen. When they landed on strange shores, they were stripped, oiled, inspected like cattle. Auction blocks rose in port towns like Savannah, Charleston, New Orleans, places where human flesh was weighed, bid on, and sold. Imagine a mother watching her child pulled from her arms, knowing she will never see that small face again. Imagine a man's last memory of his wife being her face disappearing into a crowd as another man's property. Slavery built an empire. Cotton, tobacco, rice, fields stretched further than any eye could see, worked by hands that would never taste the wealth they created. In the Deep South, the plantation became a kingdom unto itself. Big houses with white columns, manicured gardens for the master's family, and hidden behind them, the slave quarters, rough cabins that held the hum of generations forced to live in chains. In the slave narratives, countless elders speak of their earliest memories, being too small to hold a hoe, yet forced into the fields. A woman named Sarah tells of sitting on her mother's hip while she chopped cotton. The baby slept on a feed sack laid between rows, the sun scorching, the overseer's shadow never far. These were the lullabies, the hiss of insects in tall grass, the rustle of chains, the occasional cry of a child who woke to find his mother's hands blistered and bleeding. Stories of the masters. Not all masters were cruel in the same way, but none were innocent. Some fed their slaves scraps and wore out their bodies until they broke. Some gave small kindnesses, letting the children sneak leftovers from the kitchen. But every kindness was still a cage. Freedom was never theirs to taste, only to dream of. The overseer's whip. Ask the old ones what they feared most, and they'll tell you it wasn't the master, it was the overseer. A white man, or sometimes a trusted slave, given the power to break others. The whip sang across backs for the smallest mistake: too little cotton picked, a head turned too long, a word spoken out of turn. Scars were stories written on flesh, silent testimonies that no history book can ever erase. Nights in the quarters. But the nights in the quarters held more than sorrow. After sunset, when the field was quiet, families gathered by the hearth. They told stories, old African folk tales twisted into new forms: Brer Rabbit, Anansi the Spider, tales that taught survival, cunning, and hope. They sang spirituals, songs layered with secret meanings. A line about crossing Jordan might mean running north tonight. Music was rebellion. Laughter was rebellion. Every heartbeat that refused to break was rebellion. The runaways. Freedom glowed like a distant star. Some couldn't bear the weight. They slipped away in the dead of night, guided by the North Star or whispers about the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, they called her Moses, led dozens to freedom. Some were caught, dragged back, beaten until they could no longer stand. But each one who fled carried the dream that somewhere beyond the fields was a place they could live as they pleased, marry who they loved, name their own children. The birth of resistance. Slavery was not just backbreaking work, it was a constant battle for the soul. Men and women poisoned their master's food, sabotaged tools, feigned illness to steal an hour of rest. Children learned early to read trouble in the overseer's eyes. And through it all, the drumbeat of survival thudded in their chests. They whispered prayers, African spirits blended with Christian hymns, a secret world beneath the master's nose. The Civil War whispers. By the mid-1800s, the cracks in the slaveholding world widened. Newspapers spread rumors of abolitionists, free states, and the word emancipation. The enslaved heard whispers, if they could hold on, freedom might come in their lifetime. Old men sat on cabin steps, smoking pipes made of corn cobs, telling the young ones to be ready. Some even dreamed of the day the master's big house would stand empty, the fields worked by no one but the wind. The slave narratives were born from these memories, passed from mother to child, father to son, until the Writers' Project came knocking on weathered cabin doors. Interviewers wrote the words down exactly as they were spoken, dialects thick with southern soil, words bent but unbroken. These cages hold what textbooks can't, the human truth, jagged and raw. In dusty archives, these voices sat for decades, a mother's grief, a boy's terror, an old woman's defiant laughter. Now they live again. Each word you hear tonight is a piece of that chain, linking past to present. When you close your eyes, you may see them. Rows of cabins under a moonlit sky, a field of cotton shimmering like ghosts, a song drifting through pine trees. And so we begin, you and I, a promise to the past that these stories will not rot in silence, that each name spoken, Uncle Ben, Aunt Sarah, Little Millie, will echo across time, that the ocean of sorrow will become an ocean of remembrance. Let us listen. Stay with me now. For the next hours, we walk alongside them, through the heat of the fields, the darkness of the auction block, the fragile hope of freedom. We listen, we remember, and in remembering, we keep them alive. Part 2. Childhood. Innocence stolen. They say every child deserves to be born free, but in the Old South, freedom was a rumor that never reached the cabins where black babies took their first breath. Imagine your very first cry echoing against the walls of a dirt floor shack, your mother whispering prayers over you, knowing your cradle is just the first stop on a life already owned by someone else. Many of the old ones remembered their mothers singing them to sleep, soft, sad songs learned from African grandmothers they would never meet. Aunt Caroline told the writer, "My mama, she sing, 'Hush, little baby, don't you cry, master gonna sell you by and by.'" Imagine a lullaby where the sweetest promise is that maybe the Lord will come before the trader does. First steps in the fields. Children learned early that laughter had limits. A boy named Thomas said, "I was 3 when they took me to the fields. They say he can't pick, he can scare birds." So Thomas spent dawn to dusk waving rags to keep crows off the cotton buds. No shoes, no warm coat, just small hands and big eyes, watching the sun crawl across the sky. There were games too. Hide and seek between rows of sugarcane, marbles carved from clay, but always in the distance, the overseer's voice was thunder. They learned to hush when the wagon wheels creaked. Sometimes wagons carried cotton. Sometimes children bound for the auction block. The sound of wheels became the sound of goodbye. Stories in the dark. At night, families huddled in the one-room cabins, children curled up on pallets of straw. Grandmothers told stories from the old country, Anansi the spider, Brer Rabbit, tricksters who used wit to outsmart the mighty. Little ones drifted to sleep, dreaming they too could slip through traps laid by stronger hands. Each tale was a seed planted in the heart. You may be small, but you are not helpless. The auction block threw young eyes. Some children saw the block before they could spell their own name. Millie, who lived to be 97, told the Writers Project, "I was 6 when they sold me. I remember the man touching my teeth like I was a mule." She remembered her mother's screams, her own tears swallowed when the driver snapped, "Hush, gal, you his now." That moment became her first memory, not a birthday cake, not a toy, but the taste of salt and terror. Surviving separation. Brothers and sisters clung to each other like roots in the storm. Some were lucky enough to stay on the same plantation. Others held tight until the day the trader came. Parents taught them to remember. If they take you, tell them your mama's name. Tell them your daddy's name. Maybe someday someone would find them again. Maybe. Learning work before words. By the age most children now start school, these children had learned to plant, pick, hoe, cook, clean, haul water, gather firewood, and keep secrets. Secrets about what the old folks whispered when the white folks weren't around. Secrets about the North Star and the road that sometimes opened up when the master's dogs were asleep. The whip as teacher. Punishment taught lessons too. One man said he could still feel the welts 80 years later. A boy who didn't pick his share of cotton could be whipped until the rows ran red. A girl who lingered too long by the creek could find herself tied to a tree. Every scar a page in a terrible primer, teaching obedience, fear, and the fragile shape of hope. Play and small joys. Yet listen closer to these old voices, and you'll hear laughter too. There were moments when the master's eyes turned away, when children splashed in the river, chased fireflies, or traded jokes in the shadows of the smokehouse. In those small pockets of freedom, they felt the childhood they were owed, if only for a heartbeat. The quarters at night. At dusk, the quarters came alive with song and story. Candles flickered behind cracked shutters as mothers rocked babies. Fathers carved simple toys from scraps of wood. Older children learned new words in the hush of the dark, whispered Bible verses taught by elders who risked their skin to pass down forbidden letters. It was rebellion by memory. Ghost stories and night terrors. Children feared more than the master. They feared spirits that slipped through the cracks in the cabins. They feared the shape in the tree line that might be the patroller with dogs. They feared the darkness in their parents' eyes when they asked, "Where's Papa?" and Mama had no answer. For some, nightmares were the only playmates. Holidays were bittersweet relief. Christmas was different. For some, it brought small mercies. No work for a day, a piece of pork, and a sweet treat if the master was feeling generous. Children ran barefoot in the cold yard, chasing each other in freedom that tasted like borrowed time. On those nights, mothers and fathers clung tight, praying the new year wouldn't bring the trader's wagon. Remembering songs. Ask these old voices about childhood, and they will hum you songs they never forgot. Steal away to Jesus. It was a lullaby and call to freedom both. The melodies drifted up from cabins and carried far across the fields. Some say the songs rose higher than the whip could reach. Small hands, big stories. A girl named Ruth said, "I was so little, I thought the field was the whole world." She remembered her tiny hands trembling under the weight of a basket too big for her shoulders.
She remembered the way her mother's voice turned sharp when the overseer walked by. "Don't look him in the eye, girl. Keep your eyes down." Games that taught survival. Games played taught lessons. Hide and seek, because one day you might have to hide for real. Follow the leader, because one day you might follow a path north. Jump the broom. Practice for the marriage that the master might not recognize, but your heart would. Eavesdropping on secrets. They learned to listen with one ear to the grown folks' whispers. When the elders gathered around a flickering fire, the children pretended to sleep. They heard talk of Harriet, the Moses who never lost a passenger. They heard about the river crossings, the hidden safe houses, the chance that a life and freedom might bloom beyond the fields. But they also learned that not every neighbor could be trusted. Some older slaves, desperate for favor, would betray runaways. A child's eyes learned early to spot who you could trust and who you could not. Survival depended on silence. And so, childhood for these enslaved souls was not measured in toys or lessons, but in moments stolen between shadows. They dreamed of running barefoot down roads that led away from the plantation. Some dreamed of reading books like the master's children. Some dreamed of seeing their mother's face not lined with worry, but lit with hope. Those who survived kept these memories alive, passing them to grandchildren who could not believe such things had happened. But they said, "I was there, child. Don't let nobody tell you otherwise." The little boy who scared crows became an old man with stories that cut deeper than any history book. A prayer for the little ones. Tonight, we remember the children whose voices we can almost hear. We remember their small hands in heavy fields, their eyes lifted to the sky where freedom waited. We remember their lullabies and their cries. And we promise your stories will not die with you.
Part 3. Life on the Plantation. Dawn on the plantation. The day began long before the sun peeked over the trees. A conch shell, a horn, or the crack of a whip was the alarm clock for hundreds of souls. In the darkness, men, women, and children rose from wooden pallets, brushed straw from their hair, and stumbled out into the chill of morning to answer the overseer's call. Fields like oceans. The fields stretched further than the eye could see, rows of cotton like white caps on a restless sea. For the enslaved, each row was a chain. They stooped low, fingers raw, backs bent under the weight of bags that grew heavier with every step. "Pick 100 pounds a day," some masters said. 200 if you're strong. Failure meant the lash. The big house and the quarters. Life on a plantation was split down the middle. At one end, the big house, white columns, manicured lawns, fine dishes clinking behind lace curtains. At the other, the quarters, rows of cabins, mud-packed chimneys, dirt floors swept clean with homemade brooms. This was where the true heart of the people beat, hidden from the master's gaze. Kitchen slaves and house slaves. Some were chosen to work in the big house, cooking, cleaning, caring for the master's children. The house slaves wore secondhand silks and shoes that pinched their feet. They were closer to the family that owned them, yet no less chained. Some envied them. No sunburned necks, no bloody fingers. But the old ones said, "A slave is a slave. Don't matter the dress." The whispers in the kitchen. Inside the kitchens, secrets bubbled like stew pots. An old woman named Aunt Louisa told the writers, "We know all their business. Who love who lie, who steal. We know, but we can't tell." The cook's ladle stirred more than broth. It stirred centuries of survival. The field hands bore the hardest burden. In the summer, the sun scorched them. In winter, frost bit through their thin clothes. The children ran between rows, dropping cotton bowls into baskets bigger than themselves. Men swung hoes until their palms blistered. Women worked through pregnancies, through heartbreak, through beatings that left them limping but not broken. small mercies. In the midst of all this, there were moments of mercy. A sip of cool water from the creek, a berry plucked and eaten in secret, a whispered joke that made the day feel lighter for a heartbeat. Some old folks said, "We learned to find joy in scraps." Joy was all we owned that the master couldn't steal. Sunday, a day of prayer. Sunday brought a different rhythm. Most plantations gave a half day for worship. The enslaved gathered in brush arbors or hidden clearings, praying with a faith that carried them above the fields. They sang spirituals that wrapped their pain in a blanket of hope. An old man named Solomon said, "That church was our freedom. We was free in our souls." The overseer's cruelty. They feared the overseer more than the master, a man paid to break spirits. He carried a whip coiled at his hip like a snake ready to strike. Some used it sparingly, knowing a broken slave was no profit. Others relished the crack of leather on skin. One woman said, "He whipped me till I seen stars in the daylight." Her scars spoke long after he was gone. Weddings and love. Even in chains, love bloomed. Two people might jump the broom. A slave wedding, not recognized by law, but holy in their hearts. Families formed under the threat of the auction block. A father taught his boy how to fish. A mother plaited her daughter's hair, whispering prayers that the trader would pass them by. Food and hunger. Meals were meager. A ration of cornmeal, molasses, maybe salt pork if the master was feeling kind. Some tended secret gardens, traps for rabbits or fish from the creek. Children learned to hush when the master's dogs sniffed too close. Food was fuel for bodies that labored dawn to dusk, and a stolen taste of freedom when they gathered around the pot late at night. Folklore by the fire. When work was done, they gathered around fires to tell stories. Some spoke of Africa, lands their grandparents had seen. Some made up tales of Brer Rabbit tricking the fox. These were lessons in survival. Be clever, be quick, never let the master know all your mind. Secret schools. On some plantations, brave souls taught the children to read in secret. It was illegal, dangerous, but literacy was power. A letter meant a map. A Bible verse meant hope. One old man said, "I learned my letters by moonlight, hiding in the woods." His ABCs were worth 100 lashes. Music in the quarters. Music was everywhere. The banjo, brought from Africa, sang songs of sorrow and laughter. The spirituals rose like prayers, "Go down Moses, swing low chariot." They sang to mask the pain. They sang to remind each other, we still here, we still us. The silent rebellion. Every tool dropped by accident, every fence cut, every meal cooked a little poorly. Small rebellions. Some pretended illness, some broke tools, some whispered plans of running. The plantation was a machine built on human backs, and sometimes the machine broke when those backs refused to bend. Voices that refused to die. Long after the big house rotted and the cotton fields grew wild, these stories survived, passed from old to young, from hearth to church pew to dusty library shelves. The world changes, but the past lives on when we remember who built it.
Part 4. Family. Separation and loss. To be enslaved was to belong to someone else. But to be a family while enslaved was an act of rebellion. A mother's arms were a shield, a father's whispered blessing, a promise the master could not own. And yet, the greatest cruelty of slavery was that family ties could be severed with the flick of an auctioneer's hand. They spoke often of the children, the babies born in hidden corners of the cabin, wrapped in scraps of old cloth, cradled in strong arms that knew they could not hold on forever. Aunt Lizzie remembered her firstborn, sold before he could walk. They took him while I was in the field. I come back, and his cradle was empty. Fathers could do nothing but watch wagons roll away, dust settling over the trail where their sons and daughters disappeared. Uncle Sam told the writers, "I run behind the wagon till I couldn't breathe. I swear I heard my boy cry for me. Then he was gone." The auction block stood like a gallows in every slave market. Families lined up, teeth pried open like horses, muscles poked, backs inspected for scars. A strong young woman might fetch a good price, a child with plump arms, someone's investment. And the auctioneer's chant drummed over the sobs, "Sold, sold, sold." Many remembered clutching a sister's hand only to feel her slip away when the trader grabbed her wrist. A boy named Henry said, "They sold my sister to a man 2 states over. Mama said we see her soon, but I never did." His eyes were old when he told it, the little boy still alive inside him. Wives and husbands parted. Marriage was never safe. The law did not recognize the bond between enslaved men and women. Couples jumped the broom, made promises under the stars, but any dawn could bring a knock on the door and a chain on the wrist. An old man said, "They sold my wife while I was hoeing corn. I ain't see her again for 20 years." Some fought back. Mothers who hid their children in the woods when traders came. Fathers who tried to buy freedom, one back-breaking dollar at a time. Some families fled under cover of night, the North Star their compass. Some were caught and whipped. Some made it. But freedom came at a cost. Decades later, the memories still burned. The old people said their dreams were full of lost faces, children they could not bury, husbands and wives whose hands they never held again. One woman whispered, "When I die, I hope I find my babies waiting for me." Her voice cracked, but her hope never did. And yet, the very act of loving was resistance. Every child born was a promise to outlive the whip. Every secret wedding, every lullaby sung in the hush of night, these were rebellions that could not be chained. The master could claim bodies, but souls belonged to each other. Grandmothers were the glue. Too old to fetch a high price, they stayed when others were sold. They raised the children left behind, telling them who they were, where they came from. Aunt Celie, who lived past 100, said, "I raisin' 12 chillun, none of 'em mine by blood, but all mine in the Lord." Sometimes a miracle happened. Decades after freedom came, mothers found sons who had grown gray without them. Brothers crossed states to find sisters married with families of their own. Tears flowed like rivers when old arms wrapped around familiar shoulders. "Lord, have mercy! You still my baby," they'd say. And for a moment, all the years fell away. But for every reunion, there were 100 that never came. So these voices, when they spoke in the 1930s, wanted the world to know, don't you ever forget how they tore us apart. These stories were not just history, they were wounds that never healed, carried in the trembling hands of great-grandchildren who still asked, "Who are my people?" They told these stories so we would remember that love was stronger than iron chains, that families built on courage and faith outlasted the auction block, and that no master, no law, no time could erase the truth that they loved each other fiercely, even when the world tried to pull them apart.
Part 5. Freedom, Emancipation, and the Civil War. For generations, freedom was a word whispered in the fields, a dream wrapped in songs that floated over cotton rows at night. Then, word came that the white men were fighting each other, brothers against brothers, and that somehow, in that distant thunder of guns, freedom might walk through the door at last. Old folks remembered the first rumors. Masses say the Yankees comin', say they gonna free the niggers. Some masters lied to keep their hands on cheap labor. Ain't no freedom coming for you. But the voices carried. People who could not read knew how to listen. They knew when the truth was on the wind. As the war raged, plantations changed. Some masters fled with their wealth, leaving fields untended. Others forced their slaves to build barricades, haul supplies, or cook for Confederate troops. Women prayed that the battles would come and go quickly, leaving the promise of freedom behind. Then came Lincoln's words in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation. For many, it did not bring instant freedom, not yet. But it was like a match dropped in dry grass. It spread. One man told the writers, "They read it to us under the big tree. Folks shout, holla, fall to their knees. That night, we know freedom comin'." Some did not wait for official words. They ran to Union camps, hoping the soldiers in blue would protect them. These contrabands, the name given to escaped slaves, built new lives inside rough tents and makeshift cities. Some found food and medicine for the first time. Some joined the Union Army, musket in hand, fighting for a freedom they had never tasted. One soldier said, "I fight with a gun in my hand and the Lord in my heart. I know what I'm fighting for." Freedom did not come without blood. Some were captured by Confederate patrols and whipped, hanged, or shot for fleeing. Some saw their families punished for their escape. But the choice was simple: stay in chains or risk it all for liberty. The last generation to wear the yoke chose risk. One woman, Sarah, remembered the day the Union troops came. They ride in on horses, blue coats shinin'. We run out the cabins, kneel right down, thank the Lord. Master stand there, he can't do nothing. We free right then. That moment was burned into her mind, alive decades later. In some places, the soldiers gathered the enslaved under giant oaks or on courthouse steps. They read out freedom, line by line from yellowed papers. Some wept, some danced until their feet blistered. Others just stood in shock, staring at their own hands as if they couldn't believe they belonged to themselves. Freedom, though, brought new troubles. Fields still needed tending. Where would people go? How would they eat? Some stayed as sharecroppers on the same land that once held them in bondage. Others followed the road north, drawn by the promise of wages and a little piece of land to call their own. Families searching. Freedom turned old roads into rivers of searching souls. Mothers looking for children sold long ago, brothers looking for sisters. Posters appeared on trees and fences. "Looking for my wife, sold from me in 54. Any information, please send word." Some found each other. Some did not. Many freed people chose new names, a way to bury the master's brand. Some called themselves Freemen, Liberty, or Lincoln, a small claim on dignity. One man said, "They took my daddy's name when they took him, so I took my own." For a time, the government tried to help. The Freedmen's Bureau set up schools, churches, and courts. For people who had never held a pencil, learning to write their name was a taste of the power long denied. They said, "If you can read the Bible, nobody can lie to you about what it say." They spoke of 40 acres and a mule, the promise of land that would give them a future beyond the fields they once toiled for free. But that promise was broken, replaced by sharecropping contracts that too often felt like slavery by another name. The shadow of hate. Freedom did not end hatred. Night riders burned cabins, churches, and schools. The Ku Klux Klan rose like ghosts in the dark, terrorizing the same people they could no longer own. One old woman said, "We was free by law, but hunted by night."
The struggle was not over. It had only changed shape. Yet, for every threat, there was resolve. Grandfathers who could not read raised grandsons who became teachers. Women who had no voice found their voices in church pews and sewing circles. They built families out of the wreckage, built churches on faith and bare hands, built schools on pennies scraped together. The people who told these stories in the 1930s were freedom's first generation, the ones who went from bondage to ballots, from chains to churches filled with songs. They wanted the world to remember that freedom was not a gift. It was seized, held tight, and defended with blood and tears. Some packed up and left the South entirely, part of the Great Migration that would take millions north in the decades to come. They carried stories of the old fields like seeds in their pockets, planting them in new cities, new jobs, new dreams. They made sure their children knew, we come from fighters. Cemeteries still hold their names. Fathers, mothers, soldiers who died so their children would never taste the whip. The marble stones may be worn, but the truth is carved deep. They lived, they fought, they were free. They did not tell these stories for pity. They told them to light a torch, so that those who came after would not forget the price paid in sweat and blood. The Civil War ended the old chains, but the struggle for dignity, equality, and justice would echo far beyond Appomattox.
Part 6. Songs, Spirituals, and Hope. When words failed, music spoke. From the bellies of slave ships to the endless rows of cotton, songs rose, like smoke from a fire that could not be put out. For the enslaved, songs were more than melodies. They were coded messages, secret prayers, a heartbeat that reminded them, we are still here. In the fields, call and response chants kept weary hands moving. One would call, "All I got, Lord, is it a me?" and dozens would answer. The rhythm of hoes striking earth, the shuffle of bare feet, these were the instruments that kept the spirit alive while bodies labored. At night, they gathered in hush harbors, hidden places in the woods where they could praise without the master's watchful eyes. There, they sang spirituals, songs drawn from the Bible but braided with their own longing for freedom. "Go down, Moses," they sang, their voices weaving an unbreakable thread back to the story of Pharaoh. Moses' story was their story, a promise that no tyrant ruled forever. Some songs carried hidden instructions. "Follow the drinking gourd," they sang, a map pointing runaways to the North Star and freedom. The words passed from mouth to ear, never written down, each note a step toward the hope that waited in the dark. They sang for the dead, too. Funerals were moments to grieve and to remember. An old woman, Aunt Violet, said, "When we bury one of ours, we sing, 'Swing low, sweet chariot, ask the Lord to come carry 'em home.'" The songs held sorrow, but also release, a way to let the soul fly where the body never could. On some nights, they gathered for the ring shout, a sacred circle where feet stomped, hands clapped, bodies swayed like trees in the wind. They moved counterclockwise, calling out to the ancestors, raising a sound so powerful it shook the pine needles overhead. After emancipation, the songs changed, but did not die. Freedmen's churches filled with voices lifted in old spirituals. Choirs formed, passing the songs down generation by generation. What once was a hush harbor prayer became a gospel choir's Sunday morning thunder. Even now, those songs live, They laid the foundation for the blues, for gospel, for jazz, for the spiritual backbone of a people who carried so much sorrow, yet refused to be silenced. From Mahalia Jackson to Sam Cooke, from church pews to protest marches, those old songs marched too. Listen close, and you can still hear them. Voices lifted above the crack of whips, above the hush of the pine forests, above the hammer of chains. Each note says, "We endured, we believed, we dreamed of a land where we could stand tall." They sang because the spirit needed wings. They sang because hope must never die. And they sang so that when the last old voice fell silent, the echoes would remain, traveling down the years, reminding us freedom was born in song.
Part 7. Why These Stories Matter, and Closing Reflection. Paragraph 1. Why remember? Why tell these stories? Why open old wounds? Because wounds left in silence never heal. These voices were once whispered by people who were never meant to speak. People who were bought and sold, yet held on to each other and to the dream that one day the world would listen. The truth was buried. For too long, history books told only half the truth. They spoke of generals and battles, of cotton and trade, but not of the small child who cried for his mother sold far away, or the grandmother who prayed every night for freedom she might never see. Stories as resistance. These old voices are not just memories, they are acts of resistance. Every story spoken is a brick pulled from the walls that kept these truths hidden. In the 1930s, when writers sat by the firesides of these elders, they did not hear fairy tales. They heard the beating heart of America's unfinished business. They were people, not property. They remind us that these men and women were not numbers on a census, not shadows on faded paper. They were fathers and mothers who loved deeply, who laughed when they could, who sang even when the lash cracked across their backs. They built families under impossible odds, and some of those families stand strong today because they would not break. They fought for more than freedom. Freedom was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of another fight, a fight for dignity, land, education, safety. The chains fell, but new ones rose. Sharecropping, Jim Crow, lynching trees, segregated schools. And yet, through it all, the descendants of those enslaved people carried the fire forward. The echoes in our own time. When you listen to these stories now, you might hear echoes in the news today. Families still torn apart by violence, voices still silenced by power, people still marching for freedom promised long ago. The past is not dead. It breathes through our streets and our songs and our struggles. A legacy carried on. Generations that came after, teachers, preachers, artists, mothers, and fathers took what their ancestors survived and turned it into hope. They built churches where once there were hush harbors. They sent children to schools that once were forbidden. They rose up again and again, each step forward built on the backs of those who had nothing but faith and each other. The voices we keep alive. When you hear Aunt Sally's story of the horn blowing at dawn, when you hear Uncle Ben's memories of freedom read under the big tree, when you hear the songs sung in secret, you keep them alive. You become part of the promise they made. Tell it true. Tell it like we told you. What we owe them.
We owe them more than pity. We owe them truth, the full truth, not the sanitized pages some would prefer. We owe them remembrance, not just on anniversaries, but in the daily work of making sure their children's children inherit something better. And we owe them our voices, because silence is the soil where injustice grows back, where the past speaks again. This is yesterday's voice, where the past speaks again, where the stories that were almost lost now rise like a choir, where the weight of history is not a chain to drag us down, but a torch to light the way forward. Let the voices rest, but never be silent. Tonight, we let these voices rest as they asked to be remembered, not as victims alone, but as survivors, dreamers, fighters, believers. They gave us a roadmap written in blood and song and prayer. It is our task to follow it. A call to you. As you sit there, listening in the dark or the quiet glow of your room, know that you are now the keeper of these stories. Pass them on, speak them out loud, sing the songs, teach the children. And when someone says the past is gone, you'll know better. The final whisper. Because the past is not past. It's not even gone. It lives in us, breathes through us, and reminds us of what we stand to lose if we ever forget. Closing words. So tonight, may we carry these voices with us, in our hearts, in our homes, in our fight for a better tomorrow. And may we remember always what they asked. Tell it true. Tell it like we told you, so folks won't never forget. This is yesterday's voice, where the past speaks again.